Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a recommendation video on adult science fiction that takes place in virtual reality. This is a subgenre of sci-fi that I enjoy, or at least think I enjoy, although I'll admit it actually took me a while to put together this video because while I like the idea of VR books, some of them really miss the mark for me. But if you are looking for a resource, if this is a subgenre that you really enjoy or are looking to get into it, hopefully you'll find this video helpful. I do read a lot of science fiction in general, so if you're interested, definitely consider subscribing if you're not. Otherwise, let's get started. So first I just want to briefly mention one of the most popular VR books in modern sci-fi culture, and that is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I think most people know this book because for at least younger readers like myself, this was my entry point into the subgenre. It follows a young man in a dystopian future where everyone has gone online to the Oasis, which is a social media site crossed with VR where they escape their reality of this impoverished future by going and just living these virtual lives. And of course, the main character gets pulled into an Easter egg hunt in order to get control over the Oasis, and the story starts when he finds the first clue and the first key, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a really fast-paced adventure story with a lot of great 80s references. And so again, I think most people who are clicking on this video have probably already read this, but if for some reason you haven't, it is really, become a modern classic in the last few years. And honestly, I found it a lot of fun. Absolutely, is it full of pop culture info dumps? Yes, but it's kind of its charm. It's what you would expect. And in terms of the virtual reality, it's a mechanism for the story to take place, but it's not the entire story itself. So it's kind of just a good jumping off point, but highly accessible, very fun, etc. Great crossover for those of you that read more young adult books as well. So along the same vein as Ready Player One, I want to recommend something a little more underhyped that has some similar themes, and that is Save Game by Joseph Sale. And this follows a young boy who goes and participates in a competition in this fantasy virtual reality game in order to help pay for his father's surgery because he is quite sick. And within the story, you follow him as he makes friendships with other gamers and the adventures that ensue as he tries to get through the game and win the competition. And there's a few things I really liked about this. So I'd say that the game itself is a fantasy style RPG, and it felt very realistic, and actually a game that I would love to play in real life. And this is a book that I would specifically recommend to gamers because it has a lot of lit RPG language in here. It's very much talking about noobs and bros and all of that language, which either will be something you will love or it will drive you crazy. The characters are definitely very young and immature, and you really do get that young child experience of someone going through these video games and their love for it. You can tell the author himself has a love for all things geeky because just like Ready Player One, this book is covered with references to not just games but other media that really tie in with it. So it's a lot of fun, but I will say this one is a little more simple. It was a little bit predictable. I thought the characters were just, normal people and nothing particularly special. But again, if you're someone who's just in love with the subgenre or looking for more books like Ready Player One, I wanted to mention this one because it is so much more underhyped and definitely doesn't get enough attention online. Now, before I lose the rest of my audience, I better go back to some classics, and I want to recommend Neuromancer by William Gibson, which of course is the iconic story that really helped to create the foundations for what we know as a cyberpunk genre today. Certainly this list isn't specifically cyberpunk books, but in this case there is some crossover because that cyberpunk world exists in virtual reality. And I'll admit this particular classic didn't really work for me. I was never immersed in the story, but I appreciate the book for what it did for the subgenre, for what it did for science fiction in general. And there's so many books that were written afterwards that took inspiration from it. So I want to mention it here. If you haven't read it, if you are looking to pick up more classics to get further into your education of virtual reality in fiction, this is a book you'll want to check out for yourself. And along similar lines, I also want to recommend Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson, which follows a pizza delivery boy who is also a hacker in this virtual reality. And this is a great one to check out because I think that it is a more modern take on cyberpunk, and also, again, is a great inspiration for a lot of books that came later. So I read this one after reading Ready Player One, but I thought it was so interesting because you can definitely see that Ernest Cline got a lot of his ideas from books like this, and it was just very satirical. I really enjoyed how the virtual reality was described. It was creative and very much, created these ideas and images in my mind. So again, one you'll probably want to check out for yourself if you haven't yet. I do think it's very iconic for a very good reason. Next is one of my personal favorites from this list, and that is City of Golden Shadow by Tad Williams, which is the first book in the Otherworld Quartet. And this is a multiple POV story that is told from a perspective of a teacher in South Africa as well as other people throughout the world. And what ties them together is this virtual reality that exists. And particularly the teacher is investigating the VR because their own brother has become immersed in it and now can no longer escape. And then we follow other people who are both in the real world and also in the games and reality itself. And it's a fascinating story. The character work is really good. I fell very deeply in love with these characters, their relationships, their interactions. They felt very authentic. This one is interesting. I believe it's written in the 90s. And in some ways, I would say that the ideas explored in this book are a little bit dated in terms of VR, but at the same time, it's always so fascinating to see what an author imagines for the future and what predictions come true and which ones do not. And I think that this book is great because while it is science fiction, it will definitely appeal to fantasy readers because a lot of this game, or rather this book, takes place within fantasy games, and so you really get that immersion experience. And it's just epic in scale. It's chunky. It's, again, the start of a series, so if you enjoy the first book, you can keep going within it. And yeah, I just thought this one was a lot of fun. I feel like it gets some attention online, but not enough in my opinion. And definitely, again, if you're looking for a virtual reality book, this is heavily influenced. It's a huge part of the plot, and a lot of the story itself really does take place within that environment. So highly, highly recommend this one. Next, I want to take the excuse to recommend Repo Virtual by Corey J. White. And this is a bit of a cheat because the story is primarily a science fiction story that involves a heist where a man who is called the Repo Man goes about stealing an artificial intelligence. But I want to mention it because the aesthetics of this book have that virtual reality feel to it, because while it exists in the real world, everyone wears different lenses and glasses that cause them to see the world through this other lens, essentially seeing images that aren't actually there. And so in the place that this book is set, it's actually quite impoverished and ugly and full of crime, but through the lens of the virtual reality, it's made to look like a very beautiful place. There's also a lot of commercial advertisements thrown throughout, and I just really like the aesthetics of it. So again, the virtual reality is a bit in the backdrop. It's not the main part of the story in terms of plot, but I really liked how it was done. And if you just love those cyberpunk vibes in your stories, this is a fun one to check out. And again, it's a heist story. Who doesn't like a good old heist? I thought this one was very well done, and again, one that is kind of underhyped and doesn't get talked about enough online. Next, I want to recommend 88 Names by Matt Ruff, and this follows a group of gamers that run a business where they take rich people through RPG games and help them to level up their characters. And at the beginning of the story, they take on a new client. However, they realize that that person may not be who they claim to be. And the story spirals into this whole adventure with conspiracies and so forth. I like this story, or want to recommend it, because again, it does take place in an RPG that has a virtual reality aspect to it, and I think that, like some of these other books, it'll appeal to those of you that really like that gaming aspect. Although I do have the small complaint with this book that, given the premise, I would assume that people who would be interested in this book and would pick it up would primarily be people who are already gamers, which would be fine, except this book spends a lot of time explaining what a player game is and how it works, and it just goes into a lot of explanations of things that to a reader who is already immersed in this culture, who is already a bit of a geek or a gamer themselves, should already know. So I felt like I was getting explained things that I should already be aware of as a reader. So it kind of got confused in terms of its audience, but again, if you're looking for virtual reality that's focused around gaming, this is one you'll want to check out. And finally, I want to end the video by recommending another one of my favorites, and that is Final Girls by Myra Grant. This is a sci-fi novella that is set in a near future where there is this therapy that involves people working through their trauma by going into this virtual reality and surviving as final girls. So this is definitely science fiction, but it does have a lot of appeal to people like myself who happen to also enjoy horror because it really plays through the tropes of the final girl. I like to recommend this one because unlike a lot of the other ones I mentioned, this one takes virtual reality and uses it in a different way. So it's really not a game they're playing out. And this isn't a future where everyone exists online. Instead, it's a very specific use of virtual reality in order to process things. And so the story specifically follows two sisters that are working through their issues in this story. And it's just very well done. Again, a book that I feel like is kind of underhyped. It doesn't get a lot of attention online. And so I wanted the excuse to sneak it into this video. And honestly, it does fit the topic well. So if you haven't read it, I recommend it, and I think that's about it. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out? I would also love to hear your recommendations for other VR books that I should read, because I'd love to return to this topic in a future video, and I am aware that there are some popular ones that are missing from this list, which likely just means that I haven't read them at the time of filming. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing because I do read and review a lot of adult science fiction, as well as fantasy, horror, and thrillers. And you can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online with other people who enjoy VR games and fiction. And you know what? Otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.